Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are bringing you a fascinating look at an economy that honestly shouldn't exist. I mean, not in the way it currently does anyway.
Yeah, it completely defies all the traditional rules of economic development.
Exactly. So imagine a country that's physically smaller than Manhattan.
Yeah.
It has zero factories, like absolutely none, and its agricultural output is basically a rounding error,
Right, the data shows literally just a few hundred hectares of viable soil on the entire island.
which is wild. And yet the citizens there boast a GDP of over $120,000 per person.
Yeah.
That makes it one of the absolute wealthiest jurisdictions on the entire planet. So our mission today is to figure out how. We're unpacking a highly detailed 15-page academic report on Bermuda's multidimensional national development.
And this is all based on World Development Indicators, or WDI, data spanning decades?
Right. We want to figure out how a tiny dot in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean managed to hack the global economy to sustain this world-class wealth. And maybe more importantly, what invisible forces are currently threatening to tear it all down. So, okay, let's unpack this. We need to start with the geography because you really can't understand the wealth without understanding the physical trap they're in.
No, you can't. The spatial constraint is the absolute defining characteristic of their entire national story. Every single economic or political decision happens inside this inescapable physical perimeter.
We're talking about a total land area of just 54 square kilometers. And I know it's hard for you listening to this to visualize a number like that. But think about Manhattan, which is roughly 59 square kilometers. So Bermuda is smaller than that.
And what's fascinating here is how the density has compounded over time. If we look at the WBI data from 1961, the population density was around 79 people per square kilometer, which, is very manageable. You have room to breathe.
You have space for, like, sprawling single-family homes and inefficient land use.
Exactly. But fast forward to the present day, and that density has skyrocketed to roughly 1,200 people per square kilometer. The report classifies 100% of the island as urbanized.
Wait, 100%?
Yes, there is literally no rural frontier left. The entire nation operates as a single, highly dense urban environment.
That is just an incredible pressure cooker. Because, going back to the Manhattan analogy, if Manhattan gets too crowded, you have the tri-state area. You take a train to Connecticut or you move to New Jersey, there's a pressure release valve. But Bermuda has the Atlantic Ocean. There's no hinterland.
Right, there is no neighboring county to pave over when housing gets tight. And that forces the society into what urban economists call an intensive development model. Since you are physically prohibited from expanding outward, you have to build inward and upward.
Which means every square inch becomes premium real estate.
Precisely. Land becomes the ultimate luxury commodity. You cannot afford to waste it on low-yield activities. This physical reality forces a ruthless economic efficiency. You can't have sprawling manufacturing plants or, vast tracts of pasture land for cattle.
Because the opportunity cost is just too high.
Exactly. Why put cows on a plot of land when that same land could house a multi-billion-dollar financial services firm? The extreme density aggressively dictates their economic model.
So the geography essentially outlaws traditional industry. You can't farm, you can't build massive factories, you have to find another way to get rich. Which leads us to the macroeconomic data. And this is where the traditional rulebook just goes straight out the window.
It really does. Looking at the purchasing power parity, the PPP data Bermuda's GDP per capita peaked at over $120,000 around 2008.
Which is just staggering when you think about it.
It places them comfortably within the top tier of the wealthiest jurisdictions globally. They vastly outperform major continental economies. And even with global financial fluctuations, recent data shows a really robust 6.07% growth rate. They have a highly reliable engine for generating wealth.
But the wild part isn't the amount of wealth, it's how they're generating it. The report shows the service sector consistently accounts for over 90% of their total GDP.
Over 90%.
While agriculture makes up about 0.2%, and manufacturing basically doesn't register, they're making all this money without producing a single physical widget.
We're looking at the purest possible form of a post-industrial economy. Usually, a nation transitions linearly from agrarian to industrial to service-oriented. But because of those spatial constraints we mentioned, Bermuda had to basically leapfrog the heavy industrial phase entirely.
They just skipped it.
They had to. Their core engine is built strictly on non-physical trade. High-end financial services, international business, reinsurance, specialized corporate consulting.
Okay, but I have to push back on this a little bit. If I'm looking at this from a national security perspective, An economy that is 90% services and 0% physical production seems like a massive house of cards.
It is definitely exposed, yes.
Right, because if you can't grow your own food, and 300 hectares of arable land is basically just a few community gardens for a population that dense, and you can't make your own goods, aren't you entirely at the mercy of the outside world? Like, if a geopolitical crisis disrupts Atlantic shipping lanes, isn't a microstate utterly defenseless?
Well, fragility is the inherent price of admission for this specific model. You're right, they are deeply exposed to external supply chain shocks. But the data shows they offset that physical fragility with immense financial leverage.
What do you mean by financial leverage in this context?
So high-income microstates like Bermuda don't rely on local physical resources for security. Instead, they embed themselves so deeply into the global financial architecture that their stability becomes a vested interest for the larger nations. They act as indispensable nodes in global capital flows.
Ah, I see. So they provide the financial plumbing.
Exactly. They provide the complex risk management and reinsurance that allows massive multinational corporations to function. Financial services possess a value density that manufacturing just can't match.
Because you can move billions of dollars with a few dozen experts in a high-rise building.
Precisely. That extreme value density is the only mathematical way to generate $120,000 per capita GDP on an island with zero room to expand. They traded physical self-sufficiency for elite global integration.
Right, but to run an economy built entirely on invisible financial architecture, you need a very specific kind of fuel. You aren't relying on physical labor, you're relying entirely on human brainpower. And you need an infallible digital web to connect those brains to the global market.
Which brings us to a really critical part of the WDI data, the human capital and digital infrastructure metrics. When your sole export is specialized knowledge, education ceases to be just a social good. It becomes the foundational infrastructure of your entire economy.
And the data shows they treat it exactly like that. The report highlights that 100% of secondary teachers are professionally trained.
Which is a uniform standard that a lot of massive G7 nations struggle to achieve.
And female primary school completion has long stood at 100%. They aren't leaving any intellect on the table. With a population this small, you literally can't afford to marginalize any demographic. Every citizen is critical economic bandwidth.
It's a macroeconomic necessity. If the human capital pool isn't cultivated at an elite level, that 90% service economy simply collapses. There is no low-skill manufacturing sector to catch people who fall through the cracks of the education system.
Right. Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because having brilliant, highly educated people is useless for an isolated island unless they can interact seamlessly with New York, London, and Tokyo.
And that's where the digital connectivity data comes in. The internet penetration chart in the report is striking. Post-2010, the growth curve shoots almost vertically upward, hitting a 99.37% penetration rate.
It's a total S-curve. And mobile penetration is over 105 subscriptions per 100 people, meaning there are more active mobile connections than actual physical humans on the island.
That pervasive, near-total connectivity is the absolute bedrock of their economy. In the 18th century, an island's wealth depended on deep-water ports and shipping lanes. Today, those ports have been superseded by fiber-optic submarine cables.
So a severed fiber optic cable for Bermuda is basically the modern equivalent of a naval blockade.
Essentially, yes. Without total, infallible digital connectivity, their entire $120,000 per capita wealth evaporates overnight. They'd be completely cut off from the capital flows. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, the data shows they're leveraging this connectivity effectively.
Yeah, the report shows an upward trend in intellectual property, or IP, receipts, and information communication technology, or ICT exports.
Right, which is empirical proof that their knowledge economy shift is working. They're cementing their place in the international division of labor by managing digital assets, tech, and legal frameworks rather than physical goods.
Okay, but having smart people and incredibly fast Wi-Fi isn't enough to make a global conglomerate park billions of dollars on your island. International finance requires absolute trust, and trust requires unshakable institutions. Which brings us to the World Governance Indicators, or WGI data.
The WGI data is critical here. It quantifies the stability and reliability of a country's institutions. And for metrics like regulatory quality and rule of law, Bermuda consistently ranks in the global 80th to 90th percentiles.
Let's break that down for the listener, though, because
Yeah.
rule of law sounds like academic jargon. If I'm moving $1 billion in capital, why do I care that they are in the 90th percentile?
You care because it mitigates your corporate risk to near zero. Rule of law means complex contracts are strictly enforced. Property rights are absolute. The judicial system is insulated from political corruption.
Right. They aren't going to just arbitrarily seize your assets.
Exactly. And regulatory quality means the government implements pro-business policies without sudden retroactive shifts. You need absolute legal certainty if you're holding massive capital reserves for global catastrophe risks.
So the governance infrastructure is quite literally the product they are selling.
It is their primary asset. It's why capital flows there instead of to another island with lower governance scores. But, and this is a big but, the data reveals a really fascinating paradox when it comes to their integration with the global elite.
You're talking about the trade dependency data.
Yes, because they produce nothing physical, they have to import virtually everything. And the report highlights that over 93% of their commodity imports come exclusively from other high-income economies.
I saw that, and it felt like a massive red flag. Over 93% from high-income nations. That means they aren't importing cheaper bulk goods from emerging markets to keep living costs down. They're importing premium goods from the US, UK, and Europe. Doesn't that create a really fragile elite supply chain bubble?
It creates a deeply exposed, closed-loop system. The report calls their trade path singular and high-end. They generate wealth by providing elite services to high-income nations, and they immediately cycle that money back into those same nations to buy the premium goods their citizens demand.
It's like an Ouroboros of elite capital. The money never leaves the high-income loop. But if global high-income markets fluctuate, or if inflation spikes in the U.S., Bermuda absorbs 100% of that price shock.
Exactly. That stability is their greatest asset during good times, but a distinct vulnerability during periods of Western economic stress. They feel the impact on both ends. Demand for their financial services drops, while the cost of their imported physical goods stays exorbitantly high.
Wow. Okay, so they have engineered this brilliant, highly efficient economic machine. But the human system running that machine is currently going through a quiet, mathematically terrifying crisis. Let's look at the demographic data on pages 5 and 6, because this is where the success of the island starts to eat itself.
We have to start with the health and longevity metrics, because the crisis is ironically born of extreme societal success. The WDI data shows world-class health outcomes. Survival rates to age 65 are over 92.8% for women and 86.8% for men.
Which is incredible. They push the life expectancy far above the global average. You build an economic paradise, you have world-class healthcare, and people live a long time. But how does that become an economic crisis?
The crisis is in the structural shape of the population pyramid. It's completely warping. Because while citizens are living much longer, the working age population, the people aged 15 to 64 who actually generate the GDP and pay the taxes, has dropped significantly.
From roughly 72% down to 66.7%?
Right, and simultaneously, the demographic of citizens aged 65 and older has surged by 21.7%.
So the pool of active workers is shrinking, while the pool of retirees is rapidly expanding.
Exactly, and this introduces a critical metric, the old age dependency ratio. This calculates how many elderly individuals have to be financially supported by the active workforce. Back in 1960, during their demographic prime, it was a highly manageable 9%.
Barely a blip.
Barely a blip, but the recent data shows that ratio has spiked to a staggering 33.6%.
33.6%. Okay, let me make sure I'm conceptualizing the weight of that. That means for every 3 active working age people, there is 1 person over 65 who has exited the labor force. That one retiree is drawing on public pensions, utilizing healthcare, and requiring localized social services, but not generating GDP.
That is exactly right. And you have to view this through the lens of a hyper-efficient service economy. A service economy doesn't scale through automation the way manufacturing does. It requires constant human capital input to maintain that massive $120,000 per capita output.
And when the pool of workers shrinks, the engine loses its fuel. Plus, the fiscal burden is immense. You have to tax a progressively smaller base of workers heavier and heavier to support the retirees. It's the tragic irony of their success. The natural population growth is totally sluggish.
Demographers call this the transition from a demographic dividend into deep aging. And mathematically, when a microstate hits this phase with a low birth rate, there is really only one viable short-term solution to fill the labor gap.
They have to rely heavily on net migration. They have to import highly skilled foreign talent to enter the workforce, pay taxes, and support the top-heavy pyramid.
It's the only mathematical fix. But this brings us right back to the very first data point we discussed, the 54 square kilometers. They are already sitting at an intense density of 1,200 people per square kilometer, 100% urbanized. If the only solution is to import thousands of new foreign workers, where on earth do they put them?
Right, you can't absorb a massive influx of migrants into a confined space without driving the cost of housing to hyperinflated levels.
And if housing costs spiral out of control, the island becomes too expensive to attract the very foreign migrants it desperately needs to import to save the economy. It's a vicious, inescapable feedback loop.
So the labor force is shrinking, but the physical space is maxed out, so they can't import the labor they need, yet they still have to maintain this high-wire economic act to fund the pensions. It is a massive structural bottleneck. But there's another, more literal encroachment on the island that no amount of migration can fix. Let's look at the environmental data.
Yes, the climate and carbon paradox detailed in the report is an existential threat.
When we talk about climate change, it's often framed as this future projection. But looking at the WDI topographic data for Bermuda, the physical vulnerability is statistically terrifying right now. The report maps the topography and shows that 35.96% of Bermuda's total land area sits at an elevation of less than 5 meters above sea level.
Over a third of their entire sovereign territory. And the human impact is severe, with about 5% of the total population currently living in this highly vulnerable, low-elevation zone.
As a fully urbanized, isolated island in the Atlantic, their exposure to rising sea levels and intensifying storm surges is a supreme national security threat. So logically, you'd assume that a wealthy, educated nation facing this literal threat would be the aggressive global leader in green energy.
You would expect them to be the poster child for sustainability.
Hmm.
But the data here is baffling. Initially, it looks good. Total CO2 emissions peaked in the 2000s and are falling. And their carbon intensity, the carbon emitted per dollar of GDP, dropped massively from zero point 0.07 kilograms to roughly 0.033 kilograms.
Right, which economists call decoupling. They're growing their wealth while shrinking the carbon footprint required to generate it, which sounds like a huge victory. But is it real or is it an illusion? Because if you have no manufacturing, you're inherently using less carbon. They basically just offshore their emissions to the countries they import everything from.
That's a very valid critique.
So what does this all mean when you look at the energy mix? Because this is the part that genuinely stunned me. Knowing that a third of their country is near sea level, the data shows that renewable energy currently makes up less than 1% of their entire energy mix. Less than 1%. How is an island economy facing an existential climate threat still relying almost entirely on imported fossil fuels?
This raises an important question about physical realities. It seems like a glaring policy failure until you look once again at the brutal spatial constraints. It is very easy for a vast continental nation to transition to green energy, but practically speaking, when your entire nation is confined to 54 densely packed square kilometers, where exactly do you put the infrastructure?
Oh, wow. The math just clicked for me.
Right. Where do you put massive solar farms when land is valued at millions of dollars per acre and is desperately needed for housing? Where do you install sprawling onshore wind turbines with a population density of 1,200 people per square kilometer?
You literally can't. The physical footprint for traditional renewables is just too immense. That is the ultimate paradox, the very density that created their wealth, the intensive urbanization that built the $120,000 per capita economy. Literally restricts their ability to transition to green energy. You can't bulldoze a financial center to put up a solar array.
The spatial reality rigidly dictates the energy reality. They are highly motivated to transition away from fossil fuels, both for economic independence and basic survival. But their physical canvas is incredibly small, so they default to importing specialized fossil fuels to power local plants. The geography that forces you to be wealthy also prevents you from being green.
It is genuinely incredible how interconnected every single data point in this report is. Every single advantage they possess is intrinsically linked to a profound vulnerability. So let's synthesize this for the listener. Bermuda is basically the ultimate high-wire act.
It really is an absolute masterclass in extreme forced adaptation. Confronted with no physical resources and severe spatial limits, they engineered world-class wealth by fully embracing a knowledge-based economy. They built flawless digital infrastructure and elite governance to attract global capital.
But they're balancing all of that staggering success precariously on a knife's edge. They're fighting space constraints that prevent expansion, an irreversible deep aging that is suffocating their labor force, and acute climate risks that they are physically restricted from mitigating with traditional green energy.
The precise macroeconomic conditions that created their wealth are the very things that make navigating the 21st century so incredibly complex for them. They cannot outgrow their problems. They have to out-engineer them.
Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought for you to mull over. As we look globally at the massive shift toward remote work and digital nomadism, Bermuda's model of a knowledge hub without physical production looks like a blueprint for the future. Many larger countries are trying to emulate what Bermuda perfected decades ago. But given the intense fragility we've seen in their aging demographics and climate exposure, is Bermuda a preview of the ultimate decentralized utopia for the high-income digital worker? Or is it a fragile relic of a highly localized financial era that is slowly being swallowed by the sea in time?
It is a profound macroeconomic question, and the data over the next 2 decades will write that definitive chapter.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the numbers and the incredibly complex human story behind the data. Keep questioning the assumptions, and keep looking past the obvious numbers behind the world's most unique economies. Until next time.